It's a real privilege to be here. Brendan, my husband, and myself came down last night, and we've participated with great enthusiasm in the entire weekend, and it's just fantastic to think that that the rumours of the demise of the Catholic Church are greatly exaggerated. And before the Eucharistic Congress, to be honest, I didn't really know what a Eucharistic Congress was or what it was meant to be. But it was the most fantastic experience for us and for our family. And it was every so often we say to each other, oh, I wish there was another Congress. And I have to say, I've come as close as I ever have today to this was another Congress. But including one of the flaws of the Congress, which is that the young people are sequestered away in another spot. So we don't see them, and they're not with us. And while it's wonderful, and I'm sure they would much prefer to be together, that was something that happened at the Congress as well. The youth space was literally on the other side of the road. And there was this fantastic energy and fantastic stuff going on there, but it was kind of like, generational. And you might have gone away from the Eucharistic Congress saying it was fantastic, but there were very few young people. Well, there were tons of them. They were just across the road. So it's fantastic for us to get together like this, and it's really a strengthening thing for me, because in the kind of worlds that I inhabit, you can sometimes be made to feel extraordinarily strange or insane, and not in the good way that Dermot Ryan was talking about earlier, but just, you're literally, a mad person. If you're lacking entertainment, you could go into the Irish Times website and read some of the comments, particularly when I'm writing about pro-life issues, and you might not recognize the person that they're talking about, because the comments are so savage. So it's absolutely wonderful for me as well to be here, and I thank you for this privilege, and I thank all the people who put the work into it. I mean, it's just amazing. Something like this does not just happen. You have to have a fantastic steering committee, you have to have volunteers, you have to have people willing to provide the venue, and so I know they will be thanked later, but can I just thank them on my behalf and to say we really appreciate it. Some of you might know Dr. Kieran O'Mahony. He's an Augustinian and a biblical scholar. And he tells one of his favourite stories is about a Joe Duffy show a few years ago. And it concerned a family with a child for First Holy Communion. And between the jigs and the reels, getting the fake tan on and, the hair done and the tiara into the hair and the limo and the whatnot, they skipped the church part and went straight to the hotel. And there was a discussion on Joe Duffy about this, and the merits or otherwise of missing the church part, and according to Kieran O'Mahony, anyway, I didn't hear the programme. So somebody was saying, well, it mightn't be such a good idea to miss the church part of the First Holy Communion, and someone rang in allegedly and said, isn't that typical of the church, poking their nose into everything? So we're at a moment in our history where many people still find the rituals of the church meaningful, but not quite in the way that we might intend them to. They're almost like rites of passage, the First Holy Communion, the confirmation, the marriage, and the funerals. But they don't necessarily think about or necessarily value what those rituals are meant to signify. And yet anyone who suggests that, missing the church part of those rituals mightn't be the best idea is likely to get the same retort. Church can't keep its nose out of anything. Many of you know that on Facebook, if you have the inclination, you can put up a relationship status. And there's all the normal ones like married or single or in a relationship, but there's also one, it's complicated. And there's a very useful website called Urban Dictionary where you can look up what these things on the internet actually signify. And I looked up "it's complicated," and this is what I got. Any relationship that's not okay, fear of being called single, holding on to something that's about to end, still hoping to work things out, and in the denial stage of separation. And it occurred to me that for an awful lot of people in Ireland, their relationship with the church could come under the heading, "it's complicated." And it might mean any of the explanations that I've just read out to you. There are people hanging on to a relationship that's effectively dead, and they're just going through the motions. And then there are those who have the equivalent of fearing being single. They're not too crazy about it, but they don't think the alternative is much better. There's a subsection who have major problems with aspects of the church, but they still have hope and they still have passion. So they're the ones that are hanging on in there. Now, if Facebook had been around in the 1950s, there would have been very few people who would have chosen "it's complicated" for their relationship status with the church, at least not in public. You were either in or you were out. You were attending or non-attending. Internally, it might have been an entirely different matter. You might have been wrestling with doubts or scruples or worries or experiencing your faith as joyful and life-giving. But the outside probably would have looked the same, with rows and rows of people. But inside, it probably was still complicated. And it's more complicated even than that, because we've been fed the impression that period was a time of repression and of conformity and so on. But I remember being very touched when I read John McGahern's memoir. And John McGahern had his own completely unmerited difficulties with the church, lost his job and all of that. But he had a difficult childhood with elements of abuse. His mother died very young. And it was a harsh and a punitive childhood. And he writes in lyrical terms of the Presentation Brothers and the school that he went to. And he acknowledges that there were many things that were difficult in his life. But he said, the river, the church, the library, all opened outward to life and to joy. And so someone that you might say might have been bitter about it acknowledged the wonderful formation. So it's complicated. It's not a simple story. The past was neither completely repressive nor completely wonderful, and the present is neither a disaster nor completely wonderful. Sometimes we kind of give out about the fact that young people are not interested. And then you can have an experience like I had last week in my own school. We have a wonderful chaplain, Sister Nora, and she had the brainwave of asking girls if they would like to be ministers of the Eucharist, primarily for our school liturgies. And I kind of, I have to admit, my reaction was sort of lukewarm, because basically I thought I'll end up running the training course and looking after them, whatever. So it was a bit selfish, to be honest, my reaction. But as usual, she was right and I was wrong. And we got this fantastic cohort of girls, the best you could imagine. And it's brilliant to see them going around with their little pin on their collar, and they're so proud of it. And then they wanted to continue meeting after the training course, so they were meeting once a week, and they're a fantastic support to each other. And then they wanted to be, they said, well, could we do this in our parishes? And I said a fervent prayer to the Holy Spirit they wouldn't meet any cranky parish priests. But the majority of them didn't, and they're now ministers of the Eucharist at the family mass or at the young people's mass, and there's another layer of witness going on there. So this was such a success that we decided to do it again this year. And I asked the people to write letters of application, because I'd heard a little bit of a horror story in another school where somebody was asking to do the same thing and had asked teachers to send people along who were interested. And they discovered that most of the people who were interested hadn't darkened the door of a church in a long time, and one of them was Church of Ireland. So I asked them to write a little letter, and I was so angry. I'm not an angry person, But I was so angry when I read one of the applications, and I'm going to read it out to you. My reason for wanting to train to be a minister of the Eucharist is to be involved. When I was younger, I used to sing in the children's choir and serve Mass on alternating Sundays. But last year, I had to retire as an altar server, and the youth choir has now been disbanded due to lack of interest. When I talked to my parish priest about being part of the children's liturgy, a program that's run in my church, I was told I had to be 18. After so many years of being involved in my church, I really don't like not being around to help out. And that's why I think becoming a minister of the Eucharist will help me to be involved again. You know, the theme of this conference is put out into the deep. And whoever responded in that way to that girl has never left the paddling pool. It's, you know, she has a sister with a mild disability, and she is so kind and so good to her. She's utterly reliable. She's, you know, if you asked her to do anything, it would be, and what else do you need me to do? She's beating down the door of her local parish, and all they can find to say to her is, go away, because she's a year under the limit. Now, I understand about child safeguarding, and I understand about people needing guards, vetting, and all of that. But if you can't find a space for that individual, don't come moaning to me about young people are not interested in their church. You know, we need to realize we have fantastic young people. And that a lot of the time they're actually dropping out because they can't see a way they can be of service. I love the passage from that this comes from, you know, put out into the deep, because to me it's a puzzle from start to finish. When I was younger, I used to think, you know, that fishermen maybe in the time of Jesus were quite poor, and then I learned that they were more like SMEs, that they, you know, a small to medium enterprise, and that, you know, they would have been, you know, employers almost. So I'm just wondering why they couldn't catch any fish. It wasn't as if like there were Spanish trawlers coming in and scooping up the quota or anything like that. And then there's the proof that Peter is not Irish. A fisherman taking advice from a carpenter. And then immediately after they have managed to achieve the dream of every fisherman or fisherwoman, they're up to their oxters in fish. Jesus says to them, don't be afraid. Now, why would you be afraid? You have just managed to hook up with the greatest fish-finding device in history. What is there to be afraid of? And of course, the answer is that it's not about fish. It's not about being the successful owner of an SME. It's about something else entirely. And something that actually, for many of the disciples, will eventually lead to a painful death. It won't end with a painful death, but it will lead there by way of leaving all the comfortable paths they had laid out for themselves and instead being taken to places they never dreamt they would go. It's really not much of a selling point, is it? Most of us would just love to stick to the fish-finding device. But that isn't what Jesus is about. The apostles faced imprisonment, torture, and death. Christians today in Egypt and Syria face the obliteration of some of the oldest Christian cultures that exist. In Ireland, we face Joe Duffy and the occasional cross editorial in the Irish Times. It's not really comparable, is it? It's very tempting to see ourselves as under siege or being persecuted. Yet if we compare ourselves to the early church or even to penal times, you know, there are mass rocks dotted all around the countryside. What we face now is a mere pinprick in comparison. Archbishop Rowan Williams, I suppose he's Archbishop Emeritus now that Pope Benedict has made that fashionable. Archbishop Emeritus Rowan Williams warned Christians in Britain recently about feeling under siege. He was speaking at the Edinburgh Book Festival, and he said, "Persecution is not being made to feel mildly uncomfortable. I'm always very uneasy when people sometimes in this country, meaning the UK, or the United States talk about persecution of Christians, or rather believers, I think we're made to feel uncomfortable at times. We're made to feel as if we're idiots, perish the thought. But that level of being not taken very seriously or being made fun of, I mean, for goodness sake, grow up. You have to earn respect if you want to be taken seriously in society. But don't confuse it with the systematic brutality and often murderous hostility, which means that every morning you get up wondering if you and your children are going to make it through the day. That's different. It's real. It's not quite what we're facing in Western society. It's food for thought. But interestingly, he then came back and in a letter to The Guardian explained what he had had in mind. And this is what he said in the Guardian letter. He said, in suggesting that some people need to grow up before talking about the persecution of Christians, I had in mind those who offer what I think are unduly sensationalized accounts of the situation, and to a lesser extent, those in the public eye who have to put up with a certain amount of routine attack. I realize in retrospect how offensive the words might sound to those who suffer bullying for their convictions, or whose faith presents them with real and painful dilemmas in their professional lives. I want to make it clear that I'd regard urging such people to grow up as insulting and insensitive to a degree, and I apologize for giving any impression to that effect. So, what's happening to us in Ireland, particularly in the media? Do we need to grow up, take it on the chin, or is there real persecution and bullying going on? There's a little bit of both, I think. There's a knee-jerk assumption among many people who work in the media, many but not all, and that's terribly important, that the church represents the forces of regression. And that's annoying and it's unfair, but maybe it's just something that our mothers would have told us to offer up. And to make us look at using the media we do have more effectively. And the principal one is actually the captive audience that any political party in the country would love to have Sunday after Sunday. Okay, the numbers are going the wrong direction, but there are huge numbers of people still showing up in our churches. And what are we offering them in terms of life-givingness? And then there is the whole new world of the internet, which is just been at Brendan O'Regan's workshop there. And it's just amazing what's out there and how we can sustain ourselves. And it's the positive side of the internet that you can find the like-minded and you can find sustenance and so on. However, I nearly fulfilled my promise to fall off the step. I'm just going to get a glass of water. This is the however. There are real threats to religious freedom in the country at the moment. Every other week, we're being told by the Minister of Education that non-religious parents must be facilitated by taking religion out of so-called stand-alone schools. And it sounds reasonable until you realise that half the primary schools in Ireland are stand-alone schools. Half of them. And if anyone can find a census that says non-believing parents are half the population of half the parents of the school-going population, primary school population, I'd be very interested to see it. Much more seriously, it appears that the government expects Catholic hospitals to carry out not just necessary medical treatment that may result in the unwanted and undesired and deeply regretted death of an unborn baby, but abortions on the grounds of suicide. And this completely ignores the right to freedom of conscience, not to mention the right to life of every human being in this country. And it's extremely dangerous. Most of those who defied the Fine Gael party whip on the Protection Life and Pregnancy Bill didn't do so because they were Catholics, but because they could see flaws in it. But the fact that our Parliament does not allow freedom of conscience on votes that are routinely free votes in other jurisdictions, even in the place where the whip was invented. You know, it was Charles Stewart Parnell, or Parnell as they call him now, who invented the whip. He had a very disparate group of people, and so he basically whipped them into line so that they could operate as a unit. So I suppose we can't complain too much about it. But in other jurisdictions where they have the whip, on issues of conscience, like abortion, like euthanasia and so on, you're allowed to have a free vote. I know that Lucinda Creighton, for example, was contacted by colleagues from all over the European Union, many of whom did not share her views on abortion, but they were shocked and amazed that she could lose her job on grounds like this. And they found it, disturbing in a sense that that could have happened to her. You have the irony of politicians condemning the way dissenting voices are treated within the church, and I'm not saying we're great, but or that there aren't things that we could improve on that, but then political parties are operating a much more severe form of excommunication within their own parties. It's actually unprecedented that suggesting that candidates who stood up for their right to conscientious objection should be deselected as candidates for the next election. It's unprecedented, and it's a move in the wrong direction. And this is not an anti-Fine Gael rant. I grew up in a blue shirt household, and it's hard to shake it off. It's just talking about our political system in general. And it's the old thing of, they came for the Jews. If we don't stand up for the rights of people to actually, in this case, where will it end? And there is more and more a kind of a playing to the populist vote. And Bishop Kieran said to me, this morning used an expression, he said, 10-mile radius on the east coast of Ireland. And we know where that 10-mile radius is. However, in that infamous phrase that drives us all mad, we are where we are. This is where we have to witness. And if the church is in bad odour some of the time it has brought it on itself. We've brought it on ourselves. Maybe by being acting too much like a political power ourselves, or by not living up to our own ideals. And then we should, if that's the case, we should get it straight between the eyes like any other institution. And there should be no kind of mercy or compassion, because it's the church that's in the opposite, in fact, because we're preaching such ideas, we should definitely live up to them. But I think if we're to be unpopular in society, let it be for good reasons. Let it be because we're countercultural, because we stand up for those without a voice, and because we offer a challenge to a culture that's increasingly individualistic and atomized. However, there are always temptations, and the temptation we have to avoid is the temptation to see ourselves as some kind of a holy remnant, that we're in some way superior to the rest of the culture. There's a word for that, and it's Pharisee. And Jesus was harder on the Pharisees than he was on anybody else. Just because we don't prepare our children for First Holy Communion and then skip the church part, we don't need any extra brownie points. Or if we didn't leave that nice Breda O'Brien alone on Saturday afternoon and head off to the match. There's an Archbishop Charles, I never know if he pronounced him Chaput or Chaput, but he said recently that the hardest people to evangelize are those who think they're already converted. And it's true, isn't it? We can all see it in ourselves, and we can all moan about, we're the ones who are doing all the work. And there was a beautiful, it's actually an amazing document, the document that the Synod of Bishops brought out for the new evangelization. I actually, when I was going down through it, I was copying and pasting potential quotes that I could use for this talk, and I stopped, because I think I ended up with about 2/3 of the document. But this one appealed to me particularly. The work of the new evangelization consists in presenting once more the beauty and the perennial newness of the encounter with Christ to the often distracted and confused heart and mind of the men and women of our time. And this is the bit I love. Above all, to ourselves. Above all, to ourselves. How deep are our own roots? There was a popular poster back in the 1980s, and it said, if you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to secure a conviction? And I often wonder about that myself, would there? Putting out into the deep involves a really deep change in mind and heart. Interestingly, Rowan Williams spoke to the Synod of Bishops, and he had this to say. His entire talk centred, aside from the necessity for us to go to God together as the Christian churches, it was about contemplation. I said, this is the heart of what we're about. And there's a quote from him, to To put it boldly, contemplation is the only ultimate answer to the unreal and insane world that our financial systems and our advertising culture and our chaotic and unexamined emotions encourage us to inhabit. To learn contemplative practice is to learn what we need so as to live truthfully and honestly and lovingly. It is a deeply revolutionary matter. So that ability to be silent and to sit in the presence of God is the core, really, of what we're about. We live in the age of the distractible. You know, you can lose hours of your life just because you went to look up one minor fact on the internet. You can kind of wake up 3 hours later and say, how did I get to here to a cat video? You know, we live in that age where there's things coming at us all the time. And if you ask someone how they are, the most common answer you'll get now is busy, very, very busy. And if you actually shock people and say that you're not busy, they begin to worry, you know, is there something wrong with you? Why aren't you busy? Everyone else is. But learning to sit quietly, whether it's in front of the Blessed Eucharist or just lighting a candle at home, is vital. We can't compartmentalize our lives. We need to make every moment count. And Dermot Ryan looked at that very, very well this morning when he was talking about, you know, you can't have the Sunday or the Saturday night mass box and then the rest. It's the aim that everyone you meet, that you're trying to be the light of Christ for them and to see the light of Christ for them. And we hear a huge amount about mindfulness, which is a Buddhist discipline, and it's wonderful. And my goodness, I could do with mindfulness in my own life. But I read a very nice thing once that said that what Christians are aiming for is mindfulness with 2 L's instead of 1. And that is being mindful of the Spirit of God, trying to see it in others and trying to let it flow through ourselves. So a mindful of the Spirit. But that's fine when I'm here in St. Flannan's among all you wonderful people. But for a lot of people, if I started speaking like this, I may as well be speaking fluent Swahili. Isn't it true? It's just so far away from their experience. People might have a relationship with the church that's complicated, but quite often they have no relationship at all with Jesus or any idea how to develop one. As Dr. Ruth Patterson spoke about someone who experienced that moment of knowing that he was beloved. The way our culture operates today, many people don't even know that faith has the possibility of offering such an experience. And the Jesuit Michael Paul Gallagher says it's like offering people a gift that they have no idea that they need. And Michael, you know, you can see his years of lecturing in English in UCD, and it's a beautiful image, but I have to say, for a lot of people, I think it's less like a gift that they don't know that they need. It's more like being rung at tea time by a market research person who tells you that this survey is very short and it will only take 20 minutes of your life. That's what they feel like they're trying, you know, that they're being sold something, or that they're, you know, or that something that's it's not going to add to their life. It's just going to complicate their lives still further. Now, I seem to be painting quite a negative picture, so it might seem very perverse if I now say to you, I think it's a great time to be a Christian. And that's sincere, I really, really do. There's another story involving Peter, the sea, and the Lord. You remember the one where Jesus invites Peter to come to him across the water, and then Peter takes a step and he sinks like a stone. Jesus says to him gently, "Oh, ye of little faith," but he didn't let him drown. And we won't be allowed to drown either. I think anyone who's serious about her faith or his faith is being driven back to basics, and those basics are prayer, involvement in a community or a parish, reading the Gospels and partaking in the sacraments. The ultimate aim of our relationship with God is to be transformed. And I've seen it in the lives of people that I know. I was thinking recently about when I was in Mater Dei, the training college for religious educators. Clonliffe was still the seminary and for the Dublin Archdiocese, and it was over the wall. And there was one particularly acid, is the word I would use about him, clerical student. And he was the most fantastic mimic, and he was really witty. And one of his party tricks was to speak to you. If you were in a group with him, he would speak back to you in your own voice. But nobody knows what their own voice sounds like, really. And so you couldn't understand why everyone around you was falling around laughing, because you knew he was doing a funny voice. You just didn't realize it was your funny voice. And he regularly used his wit to wound. He was very bright, very clever. And then I met him 25 years later, and he's still funny and he's still wickedly accurate, but now he's laughing with people instead of at people. And you might say, well, that's just mellowing, that's just age. But in my experience, acid people tend to become more acid as they get older, not less. And I think what had happened was his immersion through daily prayer in the transformative power of the Spirit. That he had actually allowed himself to be changed, and the gifts that he had were now at the service of people and bonding people, instead of at the service of making him look incredibly smart and making him popular with the people who appreciated that kind of wit. Our true nature is that we come from love and life, we're sustained by love and life, and we go to love and life. But we all think that we're somehow the center of the universe. The light is meant to shine through us as a body. And it's you know, the expression the kids use, it's all about me. It's not all about us. It's about becoming more and more transparent, so it's less and less about us. I had to laugh this morning when Dermot Ryan was speaking, because he said, you know, he had the exact flip of a point that I was going to make, the exact opposite. This idea of Dr. Ruth's idea of finding that you're beloved. And he said, well, you know, I can understand God can love all of you people, but, you know I'm a Wally, so why would you love me? And I was actually, I have it here, I was remembering a friend of mine who said that it was very hard to get his head around the fact that God loved him, but it was twice as hard to get his head around the idea that God had the poor taste to love everyone else as well. And that came into my mind. You know, I was at the launch of the pastoral plan, at that wonderful moving liturgy that you had, and all the talents on display at it. But you're doing it as imperfect people, in imperfect parishes, with people who will get on your nerves, and you'll get on other people's nerves. Some people who never stop talking, and some people who think talking is a waste of time and let's get to the action. Some people who think everything is a form of a power grab, even the parish pastoral council, and people who never stop criticising. And imagine, God has the poor taste to love each and every one of them. And the even poorer taste to work through them. Well, they'd be much better off working through you, wouldn't they? Seeing each other with the eyes of God, it's a huge challenge. But if we can't do it in our parishes, if our parishes can't become places of welcome, where we don't just tolerate each other, but we actively look out for each other and care for each other. It's impossible if we think we can do it ourselves, but thank God, with God, all things are possible. Just a couple of things these are just thoughts really, about things that I have found helpful. I think there's something that we as a Catholic culture could bring to the rest of the culture would be very valuable. And one of them, I think, is actually a theology of marriage. That sounds terribly highfalutin. But what I mean by that is the cultural idea of marriage is you find the one. And the one will fulfill all your needs, and with a few bumps, but more or less you live happily ever after. It's a terribly damaging idea of marriage, and it's leading to a huge amount of unhappiness. It's causing people to delay getting married because they're still searching for the one. And then a lot of people are drifting into marriage because they're living together and a child comes along. It seems like the logical thing to actually get married, but it isn't actually the logical thing necessarily, because you've never actively made a decision. It's causing people to give up on marriages that are perfectly salvageable. And I think the theology of Christian marriage is something that we have a great gift to give to the culture. And there's a book I'd like to recommend. I'll give it with a little bit of a government health warning. It's called The 5 Love Languages. And it's all the ways that basically everyone has a primary way that they like to give and receive love. And we can often miss each other because you can be giving love in the way that you would like to receive it, and the other person doesn't know it. Now, the government health warning is, and I say this with great love for our American cousins, they do have a higher tolerance for cheese than we do. And so there are some bits in it that you could just see the average Irish person, particularly Irish males, going, "Oh my God, you don't want me to do that." Actually, one of my ideas is that I'll write an Irish version for it, of it. You know, the five languages are words of affirmation, in other words, being acknowledged, acts of service, receiving gifts. That sounds very materialistic, but when you read it, you realise it's not, because they could be just as thrilled with the dandelion from the garden. It's the meaning behind the gift. Physical touch, which is basically the kind of the huggy person, the person who needs, 5 hugs a day in order to operate, and quality time. In other words, getting sustained attention. And I don't know whether it's gender stereotyping, but for men, acts of service are often the way that they demonstrate their love. They do things for you and then can't understand it, when the wife doesn't get the message necessarily. And I was thinking, if I wrote an Irish version or an Irish translation of this, I'd have a character who's stunned, a man who's stunned to discover that his wife is no longer sure that he loves her. And he'll be thinking to himself, of course I love her. Don't I look after her car and keep it humming for her? But seriously, marriage matters. If we want vocations to the religious life and the priesthood, we have to strengthen families. That's where they come from. The ability to give that kind of a sacrifice comes from a family where that's modelled. And it's a cliche to say it starts in the home. It absolutely does, though. And every time I come to talks like this, one of the questions that's asked is by grandparents. And it was asked this morning of Dermot Ryan. My grandchildren have no opportunity to grow up with faith. My adult children are good people, but they're not handing on to their children what they got from us. And it's a source of huge sadness. Because if something's really vital to your life and your adult children are very good people, but they have no space for it, it's like a big wound in the middle of your chest. And then you see your beloved grandchildren and they're not getting it either. And I'd say 2 things to it. Firstly, those of you who still have young children, think every day about what you can do to nurture their faith. And preferably something really simple. I'm at a slightly different stage now. My youngest is 12, my eldest is 20. But we've instituted after dinner 3-minute prayer. And basically what we do is we read the gospel from the Sunday that's coming up, and then we have literally 3-minute silence, which doesn't sound like a lot, but to teenagers that's long. And then we say prayers, and we include all the intentions in that. I'd say something similar to what Dermot said this morning, to those of you who are worried sick because your adult children are no longer involved. Preach only by example. There's absolutely no point in nagging. You'll only drive them further away. Or those kind of hints, and I'm an Irish mammy, so I'm allowed to say this, that the Irish mammy specialises in. Oh, thank you very much for that now, but if you really wanted to please me. Which really, is in diplomacy terms, is not going to get you anywhere. And then, obviously not in a way that cuts across what your children, they're the child's parents, but bring as much religion as you can into your grandchild's life. If I had a euro for every child that I have taught that has received something from gran or granda, and it's a huge event in a grandchild's life when the grandparent dies, they absolutely love their grandparents to pieces. That's a seed that's being sown. And I want to tell you a story that I think might raise your hearts a little bit. A few years ago, one of my 5th years came to me and she told me that a group of them were starting to meet for coffee on a Saturday afternoon, and then they were going to Mass on Saturday night. And you could have knocked me over with the feather. And then I was looking at her, and I was kind of mental image of her parents in her mind. And I realised she came from a home that would have much preferred if she was meeting for coffee and smoking pot than if she was actually going to Mass. And if she admitted it at home, it would probably, there'd be an anguished conversation. Where did we go wrong, darling? So rebellion might save us in the end. The only way this girl had of rebelling was by actively exploring her faith. Now, that's a tongue-in-cheek story, but I'm half serious about it. It's absolutely not true. What you never have, you never miss. That saying is completely wrong. What you never have, you can actually miss. And it's only, though, there'll be only something to come back to if we keep the fire lighting. I'm doing The Road, Cormac McCarthy, with my Leaving Certs at the moment. I don't know if any of you have read it. I don't want to spoil it for you, but basically it's about, they don't even have names, a man and a boy. It's a very, very grim book in many ways, be in the whole of your health when you read it. And they're in a post-apocalyptic world where the world has literally turned to ash, literally. And the man is trying to keep his child alive and keep, as well, the fire alive. And they talk about carrying the fire. And they talk about, this is a world which is completely broken down. There's cannibalism, there's slavery, there's killing on a routine level. But they try and maintain their standards. We're not in a post-apocalyptic world, but we do need to keep the flame alive. And we'll only be able to do that if our parishes are places of personal transformation. If our parishes, and that sounds terribly highfalutin and terribly un-Irish, but what that means is there's a welcome there. We're reserved in many ways. We're friendly on the surface, but very few people get past the door of our homes, and that's not likely to change, really. But there are so many things that we can do that actually build community. I'll give you an example that we only missed when it was gone in my own parish. We used to have a thing called Lemonade Sunday. And for kids who have everything, it would amaze you how much the kids looked forward to Lemonade Sunday. Basically, all we did was give them biscuits and minerals in the basement of the church, and then a cup of tea for the adults, and adults got to chat. And then the basement got flooded, and we couldn't use it anymore, and there was no other handy venue. And I'm telling you, we really miss Lemonade Sunday, because people are not connecting with each other. I know urban parishes are very, very different, but that ability to actually see another adult for whom this is important and bringing their child along was really, really significant. And then another thing that was done in my parish, not by me at all, was that at Advent and Easter, or beg your pardon, Advent and Lent, there were little challenges offered to people. And last Advent, one of our parishioners developed a random act of kindness motif, which was that on one Sunday you collected a slip of paper and you didn't get to choose it. And if you'd carried out the act of kindness, you took a little sop of straw and you put it into the crib to prepare the way for Jesus. And she thought it would be the kids, and she couldn't get over it when she saw all the adults queuing up to get their random act of kindness. Now, the edict, unfortunately, went out in the Dublin Archdiocese that 2 churches apparently burnt down, that we were to take the straw out of the crib. I think we ignored that one. I think we let that go. Parishes are going to change. They're changing already. It'll no longer be about a particular parish boundary or which team you're playing for. It'll be where people are gathering as communities to worship. But our schools are going to change. Not just because, some of them will be handed over voluntarily, but that presumption that Dermot Ryan spoke about, he's quite right. You can't presume that it's enough. And he was very kind about schools, but a lot of schools are Catholic in name only as well. I mean, I'm a teacher. I'm one of the Book of Heroic Failures people. I've been struggling for 30 years to try and pass on faith, and maybe not doing so great of a job of it. So I'm not knocking my colleagues, but I know that there's second and third generation of people who didn't get a great formation, and it's very hard for them to pass on what they didn't get. But just to tell you one little story that might cheer you up before we finish up. A friend of mine, no, she's not a friend, she's someone I met at a meeting. She came up to tell me this story after I'd given a talk. She works in quite a deprived parish in Dublin, and they used to hold First Holy Communion meetings for the parents, and they were sparsely enough attended. But the rumour got out, and she has no idea how, that a perfectly ordinary First Holy Communion meeting was the meeting where they were going to announce that they were going to be one of the schools that was divested. In other words, it was going to be handed over to non-Catholic patronage. And the place was packed when she arrived in, absolutely packed, with people saying, "Oh, listen, you can't hand over the school. There's absolutely no way. What would we do without you? And how would we pass on the faith to our own children without you? And you just can't. You can't hand it over." And they kind of went, "We're not actually planning to hand over the school." And they all went, "Oh, phew." And she was stunned, absolutely stunned. She would never have predicted that that would be the place where they would suddenly discover a love for. But one woman at the meeting summed it up. She said, "I want my children to have the opportunity to have what I had." So there is a depth there. There is, and when things are in danger of being taken away from you, you can suddenly think there's something valuable here. I think that 3 quick thoughts for you. We're always given out about the media. I do it myself, constantly. How often do you praise? A very senior person in RTE told me the only reason they're still broadcasting the Mass and the services is because of the number of handwritten letters they get saying thank you. And they get almost no handwritten letters or typed letters saying thank you for anything. So they're willing to invest the money in it because people are grateful. And my husband once had a situation where I was on a programme and he felt I was very unfairly treated. And he wrote to the Director General. And then I was on another programme a week later and it was a model of fairness. And he wrote to the Director General again and said, thank you so much, that was fantastic, that's how it should be. And the Director General, actually, it wasn't the current man, lifted the phone and said, I had to talk to you personally, he said, because I get many, many letters of complaints, but I almost never get letters of praise when we get things right. So how often do we praise? How often do we lift the phone to say, that was a fantastic programme, can we have more of that? Or it was wonderful to see 2 pro-life people versus 2 pro-choice people. Can we have more of that? You know, another quick thought, liturgy. Liturgy is very, very important. Many years ago, my husband was involved in a mass of, it wasn't a mass, it was a liturgy of thanksgiving, a prayer service of thanksgiving. And it might seem counterintuitive that, you know, why would people want to thank God for things? But it turned out thousands of people had things they wanted to thank God for. And they involved everybody in the parish. They got the scouts to deliver leaflets. They got the kids in the primary schools to do posters. They asked all the major groups to have some little part, whether it was getting the teas or whatever. And the priest said, we'll let the normal evening mass go ahead. And so there was the normal sparse number. And then, as they were leaving, the whole church started to fill up as if it was the Easter ceremonies. And people there dying to give thanks. And it's that kind of imagination thing that Dermot Ryan was talking about, thinking outside the box. There's also the whole idea of involving young people in things where they can actually do something, or even where they're just getting together for film clubs. And that idea of texting people, text is the medium, really, that people use, getting people signed up so that there's something dropping into the inbox regularly. All of these things are very, very important, and they're all things that are simple. They're straightforward. They're not going to demand a huge amount of us. So we can live our lives given out about what is gone, which might have been complicated in the first place, or we can actually live our lives being thankful for what we have, thankful for the fact that we don't have to worry about our lives being threatened simply because we want to be Christians, and with a certain sense of joy in the midst of it. It's not a happy-clappy kind of thing. Joy is a different thing to happiness. You can be in the midst of sadness, but you can have a bedrock thing in here that sustains you. And I think that's what each of us needs to discover for ourselves and to hand on to others. And if I can find it, I'm frantically flipping here through my pages to find just something. I think Pope Francis is fantastic. I think his style is so warm and so human, and I'm sure, as someone was saying earlier, he's giving heart attacks to his press office because they don't know what he's going to come out with next, or who's going to phone, you know. There's a very funny thing on the internet that you should look up. It's not scurrilous, it's actually very funny. How to respond if the Bishop of Rome phones you. This is not a dilemma. There never had to be etiquette for this before. It's not something that people really had to worry about. It's and it includes things like not laughing out loud and saying, "Ah, yeah, go on," or getting so flustered that you leave them hanging on the phone and run off. So it's worth looking up. But in Rio, he gave this fantastic, really short kind of catechesis to young people, and it's the parable of the sower. And, you know, we're normally inclined to think of the parable of the sower, meaning, you know, some people are fertile soil, some people aren't. But he took it that we all have all of those things in it. All of us have the rocky ground, all of us have the thorns, and all of us have the good soil. And he ended with this: today I am sure that the seed is able to fall on good soil. Say to Jesus, look upon the stones, the thorns, and the weeds that I have, but also look upon this small piece of ground that I offer you, so that the seed may enter my heart. That's a good note to end on.